I remember the sound of the lock more clearly than the wedding vows that came after it. It wasn't loud. It didn't slam. It didn't echo. It was just a soft, careful click. The kind of sound someone makes when they don't want to wake the house. That was how I knew it was intentional. I stood in the middle of the room, still holding my breath from the sentence I hadn't finished saying. The words were caught somewhere between my chest and my mouth, suspended like dust in the air. I didn't turn around right away. I didn't want to give that sound more meaning than it already had. But meaning has weight, and it settles whether you invite it or not. The fire in the hearth was dying, not dramatically, no sparks, no final blaze, just a slow retreat, ember by ember, as if even the fire understood it wasn't needed anymore. Across from me, my wedding dress hung in silence, white, too white, so white it looked unreal, like something that had never been touched by a body. I remember thinking how strange it was that something meant to mark the beginning of a life could feel so much like an ending. I walked to the door. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. Not yet. I placed my hand on the knob and turned it gently. The way you do when you expect it to open, when it didn't. I tried again, slower this time, as if patience might persuade the mechanism. Nothing. The door didn't move. I pressed my palm flat against the wood. It was cold, solid, the kind of cold that doesn't respond to warmth, the kind that reminds you it was never meant to. That was the moment something shifted. Not fear, not anger, recognition, because this wasn't unfamiliar. I had been locked out of things my whole life, conversations, choices, emotions, versions of myself I was never allowed to explore. This was just the first time it came with an actual key. I rested my forehead against the door and listened. No footsteps walking away. No murmured instructions to the staff. No hesitation. Which meant the decision had been made long before this night. Behind me. The room felt enormous, too large for one person. Every sound I made came back to me, slightly delayed, slightly distorted. My breathing, the soft rustle of fabric as I moved, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I turned slowly. The dress stared back at me. I had been measured for it weeks ago. Dozens of hands had touched me, adjusting, pinning, tightening, all of them professional, all of them efficient. No one had asked how it felt. They had only asked me to stand still, stand straight, chin up, shoulders back. I had learned those instructions early in life. The fire cracked softly, a final protest, then settled into a dull glow. The shadows stretched longer along the walls, bending the shapes of furniture into something unfamiliar. The room no longer looked like mine. It looked staged, prepared. Like everything else. I sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to wrinkle the coverlet. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. I didn't count how many times it rang. I already knew what time it was. Late enough that no one would intervene. Early enough that there was still time to adjust. I thought about screaming. The idea crossed my mind briefly, like a door opening and closing inside my head. I imagined the sound tearing out of my throat, loud and ugly and undeniable. But screaming is a language you learn only if you believe someone will answer. I had been raised on a different vocabulary. Silence, compliance, grace. I took off the jewelry I had been given for the ceremony. The necklace first, then the earrings. Each piece was expensive, Each one caught the firelight and scattered it across the room in sharp, glittering fragments. I placed them neatly on the dresser. I didn't want them touching my skin anymore. My shoes were lined up by the wall, toes pointing outward. Ready. They looked eager, prepared for a journey I hadn't chosen. I wondered, briefly, what would happen if I refused to wear them? The answer came quickly, fully formed, as if it had been waiting for the question. The door would open in the morning. Smiles would appear. Hands would smooth my hair. Voices would tell me how beautiful I looked. And no one would mention this night. That was how it always worked. Moments like this were meant to disappear, swallowed by ceremony, buried under applause, erased by photographs that showed only what was acceptable to remember. I lay down without undressing. The mattress was firm, unforgiving. I stared at the ceiling and traced the faint cracks in the plaster with my eyes, mapping them like escape routes that led nowhere. I tried to recall when I had last felt certain about something, not hopeful, not optimistic, certain. The answer surprised me. I had been very young enough to believe that if I followed the rules perfectly, something would eventually be given back to me. Freedom, choice, love, some version of myself that hadn't been edited for public display. I closed my eyes. The room didn't disappear. It pressed closer. Time moved differently there. It didn't flow. It accumulated. Each minute stacked itself on the next, heavy and unmoving. I measured it by the fire going out completely, by the cold creeping into my feet, by the way my breathing slowed as my body adjusted to the reality it had been placed in. At some point, I stopped waiting for the door to open. That was the most dangerous moment of all, because hope, once released, doesn't scream when it leaves. It slips away quietly, like a servant dismissed without ceremony. When sleep finally came, it wasn't gentle. I dreamed of corridors, endless ones, doors on either side, all identical, all locked. I walked past them barefoot, my steps soundless, my hands numb from trying too many handles that refused to turn. I woke before dawn. The room was gray. The fire was dead. The dress was still there. So was the door. And I understood something with terrifying clarity. This wasn't about marriage. It wasn't about reputation. It wasn't even about obedience. It was about ownership. I was not being prepared for a life. I was being transferred. When the key finally turned a few hours later, I didn't flinch. I was already standing, already composed, already wearing the face they expected to see. Because the truth is, the door didn't break me. It taught me how to disappear without leaving. And once you learn that, the world can take almost anything from you, and still never notice what it lost. I used to believe that the most important moments in life announced themselves, that there would be music, or shouting, or at least some warning sound loud enough to prepare you. I was wrong. The moment that changed my life forever arrived the way snow does in a quiet city, without drama, without permission, and only noticeable once it had already covered everything. It began with the door, not the front door, not some grand threshold, just a simple bedroom door, polished wood, brass handle, recently oiled so it wouldn't creak. I remember standing in the center of the room when it happened, my back turned, my hands folded loosely in front of me like I had been trained to do when waiting. I was listening to the fire die, that slow sound of surrender, wood cracking, then retreating, click. That was all. A soft, precise sound, someone locking something they believed already belonged to them. I didn't turn around immediately. Part of me hoped, foolishly, that if I didn't acknowledge it, the sound might lose its meaning, that it would remain just a noise, not a sentence being passed. But meaning doesn't need permission. I walked to the door and placed my hand on the knob. Cold. Not just cold from winter air, but cold in the way metal becomes when it has no intention of responding to you. I turned it gently. Nothing. Again. Slower. Still nothing. Only then did I let myself breathe. I leaned forward and rested my forehead against the wood. It smelled faintly of polish and something floral, the same scent that lingered on my mother's gloves, the smell of control dressed up as elegance. I didn't knock. I already knew no one would answer. That house had many rules, but one stood above all others. Once a decision had been made, it was never discussed again. Behind me, the room felt larger than it should have. The ceilings were high. The walls decorated in pale colors meant to feel calming, but calm, I had learned, was often just another word for empty. My wedding dress hung across from the bed, white, pressed, perfect. It didn't look like clothing. It looked like an agreement. Weeks earlier, women I barely knew had circled me with pins in their mouths and tape measures around their necks. They adjusted the waist, the shoulders, the neckline. Their hands were quick, professional, indifferent. No one asked how it felt. They asked me to stand still. I had been standing still my whole life. I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress didn't sink beneath my weight. It held firm, as if refusing to acknowledge me fully. I remember thinking how appropriate that felt, somewhere in the house. A clock chimed. I counted the strikes without meaning to. Each one felt like a door closing somewhere else. I wondered if this was how it happened for other women like me, not the ones in novels, not the ones in scandals, but the quiet ones, the obedient ones, the ones who disappeared into good marriages and were never heard from again. I took off the necklace they had given me, gold, heavy, too warm against my skin. Then the earrings. I placed them carefully on the dresser, lining them up so they wouldn't touch. I didn't want them tangled. I didn't want them confused. I wanted at least something to be orderly. My shoes waited by the wall, perfectly aligned, facing outward, as if already prepared to leave without me. I lay back on the bed without undressing. The ceiling above me was cracked in places, thin lines that branched outward like veins. I followed them with my eyes, tracing paths that led nowhere. That was when my mind did something it hadn't done in a long time. It wandered backward. I don't remember my childhood as happy or unhappy. I remember it as managed, from as early as I can recall. There was a correct way to exist, correct posture, correct tone, correct timing. My mother believed deeply in improvement. Not growth, improvement. Growth was organic, messy, unpredictable. Improvement could be controlled. She corrected my spine before I learned to read, sometimes with words, sometimes with a thin rod slipped into the back of my dress. "A lady does not fold," she used to say. "She holds." I learned to hold my body, then my expressions, then my thoughts. Affection was conditional. Praise was earned. Silence was rewarded. My father existed somewhere on the edges of this training. He was not cruel. That would have required attention. He was simply absent. He brought gifts instead of presents, small things, trains, books, trinkets from his travels, objects that tried, unsuccessfully, to replace time. I thanked him properly, always. That pleased everyone. I learned early that being easy was safer than being loved. The room grew colder as the night deepened. The fire surrendered completely, leaving behind a smell of ash and smoke that clung to the air like a memory no one wanted to name. I thought about screaming. The idea passed through me like a sudden wind. What would happen if I did? Would servants come running? Would my mother rush back, startled, exposed? The image felt unreal. Screaming was a language reserved for people who believed their pain was allowed to exist. Mine had always been considered inconvenient. I closed my eyes. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was sharp and fragmented. I dreamed of hallways, endless ones, lined with doors identical to the one behind me. I walked barefoot, my steps soundless, my hands numb from trying handle after handle that refused to turn. I woke before dawn. The room was gray, flat, unforgiving. The dress still hung where it had been. The door remained closed, and with that came the clearest thought I had ever had. This was not a mistake. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was planning. When the key finally turned hours later, I didn't jump. I was already standing, already composed, already wearing the face they expected, because somewhere during the night, I had learned something crucial. The door had not locked me in. It had confirmed what I already was. Property. People often assume that control begins with cruelty. They imagine shouting, punishment, bruises that can be pointed to. That is a convenient lie. Real control begins much earlier, before resistance has a shape, before a child learns that wanting is something that can exist separately from permission. My mother did not raise me to be obedient. She raised me to be correct. There is a difference. Obedience can break. Correctness becomes instinct. I don't remember the first time she corrected my posture. Only that by the time I noticed it happening, my body already anticipated her hand. Straighten, lift, hold. Sometimes it was a word, sometimes just a look, a glance that said, "You are being watched." That look followed me everywhere, at breakfast, where my hands were guided, not pushed, never pushed, into the proper position beside my plate. At lessons, where mistakes were not scolded, but quietly rewritten until they disappeared. At social gatherings, where I learned to smile without showing too much teeth, to laugh without sound, to speak only when spoken to. Especially then, my mother believed childhood was wasted potential. She treated it the way other people treated raw material, something to be shaped before it spoiled. "You will thank me one day," she used to say, watching my reflection in the mirror more than my face itself. "I am preparing you for a world that does not forgive softness." At that age, I didn't know what softness was. I only knew tension. The house was always quiet, not peaceful, managed. Servants moved carefully, speaking in low voices, as if the walls themselves were listening. Doors closed softly. Footsteps were measured. Even laughter felt rehearsed. There was a schedule for everything: wake, dress, lessons, meals, practice. I learned languages before I learned how to argue, music before mischief, etiquette before comfort. I could curtsy flawlessly before I could run freely, if I did something well. My mother nodded, if I did something poorly. She didn't raise her voice. She simply corrected me, again and again and again, until the mistakes stopped appearing. That was her greatest skill, erasing error without ever appearing harsh. From the outside, people admired her. "She's so devoted," they said, "so disciplined, so involved." They never saw the way my shoulders tightened when she entered a room, the way my breath changed. Children learn danger long before they learn language. My father existed like a distant country. He appeared occasionally, brought gifts, then vanished again behind business and travel and obligations that felt vague but absolute. He was kind when he remembered to be. But kindness without presence teaches a child something dangerous. That absence is normal. He gave me a small silver train once. I remember holding it in my hands, feeling its weight, admiring the tiny wheels. I wanted to ask him to stay. Instead, I thanked him. He smiled. That was enough for everyone. There were mirrors everywhere in that house. Tall ones, wide ones, perfectly placed. I learned to see myself before I learned to feel myself. My mother would stand behind me while I practiced walking, her hands hovering just inches from my shoulders, never touching unless correction was required. "Again," she would say calmly, "too much sway, too much hesitation." I learned to glide, to move like I wasn't entirely made of flesh. When other children scraped their knees, I sat inside practicing scales on the piano. When they played loudly, I whispered answers in French. I did not envy them, not yet. I didn't know I was missing anything. That is the most efficient form of deprivation. The first time I noticed the difference was at a garden party. I must have been 8 or 9. Children from other families were running through the hedges, their clothes wrinkled, their hair undone. Their laughter came in bursts, sharp, uncontained. I stood beside my mother, hands folded, smiling politely when spoken to. One of the girls looked at me and asked, "Why don't you play?" I didn't understand the question. "Play what?" She laughed and ran away before I could answer. My mother leaned down and adjusted the ribbon in my hair. "Don't stare," she whispered. "It looks common." That word stayed with me. Common. It became the quiet threat beneath everything. Do not slouch. It looks common. Do not speak too freely. It looks common. Do not want too much. It looks common. I learned to fear that word more than punishment. Affection in our house was earned. A good performance, a proper response, a successful appearance. Then a hand on the shoulder, a brief smile, never warmth. Warmth was considered indulgent. I began to understand that love, in this world, was transactional, and I was being trained to be valuable. At night, after lessons were finished and the house settled into its controlled quiet, I would lie awake and listen. The distant clink of glass, the low murmur of adult conversation, the soft ticking of clocks placed carefully throughout the house. Time was always present, always measured. I imagined it as something physical, a structure being built around me slowly, brick by brick, rule by rule. I did not yet know it was a cage, only that it was solid as I grew older. The corrections became more subtle, less about posture, more about expression. "You're thinking too much," my mother would say, watching my face. "Don't let it show." I learned to keep my thoughts inside, to smile even when confused, to agree even when uncertain. Especially then. The world rewarded me for it. Teachers praised my discipline. Guests complimented my composure. "She's so mature," they said. What they meant was, she doesn't trouble us. By the time I was 12, I understood something important. My role was not to be, it was to represent a family, a reputation, an investment. My body, my voice, my future, all of it belonged to something larger than me. And because this had always been true, it did not feel shocking. It felt inevitable. That is how ownership survives. I don't remember the exact day I realized I wanted something else. Not something more. Not something better. Just something mine. It didn't arrive as a decision. It arrived as discomfort. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Only lingers. A sense that the air around me felt thinner than it should. That every breath required permission I didn't remember granting by then. I had learned to perform so well that even I believed in the role. People called me graceful, composed, impressive for my age. What they didn't say, what they couldn't see, was how exhausting it is to never be accidental. By 16, my days were already planned months in advance. Lessons in the morning, appearances in the afternoon, evenings shaped around dinners where my presence mattered more than my words. I was introduced before I spoke, summarized before I existed. "This is my daughter," my mother would say, her hand light on my back. "She has been educated privately." That sentence followed me everywhere. It meant she belongs to us. It meant she is finished being formed. I learned to read rooms quickly. Who mattered? Who didn't? When to smile? When to lower my eyes? I learned how men looked at me. Not directly, not boldly. As if measuring something. As if trying to calculate future value without appearing rude. Their mothers looked more openly, approval in their eyes, assessment in their posture. I understood then that my childhood had not been preparation for adulthood. It had been preparation for evaluation. It was at one of these dinners that I first noticed him, not because he was remarkable, but because he wasn't trying to be. He spoke when spoken to, listened more than he talked, didn't look at me like I was a finished object. When our eyes met, he didn't hold my gaze to test me. He smiled, briefly, and looked away. That alone felt dangerous. Later, I learned his name, but names come after feelings, and the feeling was unfamiliar enough to frighten me. We spoke by accident. That is important. Not arranged, not orchestrated. I had stepped away from the table to escape the heat and the voices, the endless polite inquiries about my studies, my interests, my future, as if it were already public property. He was standing near the window, looking out, not performing, not positioning himself, just standing. "I hope this doesn't sound rude," he said, without turning fully toward me. "But you look as though you might appreciate the quiet." I should have smiled politely and excused myself. Instead, I laughed. It surprised both of us. A real sound. Short, uncontrolled. He turned then, not startled, curious. That look alone felt like stepping into cold water. Awake, unprotected. We spoke about nothing important. Books, travel, weather. And yet, something shifted. He asked questions without steering the answers. He listened without correcting. When I paused, searching for the right response, he didn't fill the silence for me. No one had ever done that before. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was romanticizing novelty. That attention always feels like oxygen when you've lived in narrow spaces. Still, I noticed myself thinking about him, not in the way novels describe, quietly, inconveniently. I wondered what he thought when no one was watching. I wondered how it felt to speak without rehearsal. I wondered, and that alone felt like betrayal. My mother noticed the change before I did. She always did. She noticed the way my attention drifted, the way my smiles arrived half a second late, the way my posture, though still perfect, carried tension she hadn't placed there. "You've been distracted," she said one morning, watching me from the mirror while my hair was being arranged. Her voice was calm. It always was. "I've been tired," I answered. She nodded, as if accepting the explanation. She didn't believe it. Belief was not required. The meetings continued, brief, rare, always supervised by circumstance, if not people. A few words exchanged at a gathering. A glance held a moment longer than appropriate. A letter, carefully written, carefully delivered, carefully read and reread until the paper softened. Nothing improper, nothing scandalous. But hope does not require permission to grow. And hope, once rooted, becomes visible. I knew when she found the letter, not because she confronted me, because the house changed. Schedules tightened, invitations vanished, doors closed more often. Not slammed, closed, corrected, at dinner that night. My mother spoke of the future, casually, confidently. Plans, introductions, prospects. As if nothing had shifted, as if the ground beneath me had not already cracked. I listened, nodded, played my part. But something inside me had begun to resist quietly, not loudly enough to be punished, just enough to exist. That night, she came to my room. No announcement, no warning. She sat in the chair near the window, her posture perfect even in rest. "I've been very patient," she said. I waited. "I did not raise you to embarrass yourself." I said nothing. Silence was safer. She looked at me then, really looked, as if reassessing an object she believed she understood completely. "You are mistaking attention for freedom," she continued. "It is a common error." The word common landed exactly where she intended. "You are not in love," she said. "You are being distracted." I felt something rise in my chest, not anger, fear, because for the first time, I understood that wanting could be punished. "I only wanted," I began. She raised her hand, just slightly. "Enough. What you want is irrelevant," she said calmly. "What matters is what you represent." There it was, spoken plainly. No softness, no apology. "You will stop this," she said, "and you will thank me later." She stood, straightened her gloves, left. I sat there long after she was gone, listening to the house settle around me, the walls, the rules, the expectations, all pressing inward. And for the first time in my life, I did something reckless. I imagined leaving, not running away, just stepping out, choosing a life where my presence did not need justification. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying because once imagined, it could not be erased. I didn't know then how quickly the cost would come, how swiftly hope is punished when it grows in controlled spaces. I didn't know that this small, quiet wanting would lead me to a locked door, to a night that would strip choice from my vocabulary. I only knew one thing. I could no longer pretend that the life prepared for me was enough. And that knowledge, that single, fragile truth, was the most dangerous thing I had ever owned. There are rooms that stay with you long after you leave them. Not because they were beautiful, not because something extraordinary happened there, but because A part of you never walked out. I didn't know that room would become one of those places. Not at first. At first, it felt temporary. A correction. A pause. That was how everything in my life had always been framed. Never punishment. Only adjustment. The door closed behind me with the same careful restraint I had grown used to. No anger. No raised voices. Just certainty. "This will help you think clearly," my mother said. Her tone was reasonable, almost kind. She didn't slam the door. She didn't threaten me. She didn't need to. I stood there for a long moment after the lock turned, listening to her footsteps recede. They were unhurried, confident, the steps of someone who knew the house and the people in it, would obey. The room was smaller than mine. Not bare, not cruel, just reduced. A bed, a chair, a desk, a window that did not open more than a few inches. The walls were pale, undecorated, no mirrors. That absence struck me immediately. I hadn't realized how much of myself had been constructed through reflection until it was taken away. The first day passed slowly. Not dramatically. There were no tears, no collapse. I sat, I stood, I paced. I told myself it would end soon, that this was only to frighten me, to reassert boundaries. I believed that because believing it made the air easier to breathe. Meals were delivered quietly. A knock, a tray left outside. No conversation. When I opened the door to retrieve it, the hallway was empty. The house was always empty when it needed to be. Time stretched, without lessons, without schedules, without appearances. I felt disoriented. I hadn't realized how much of my sense of self came from being directed. Left alone, I didn't know what to do with myself. That frightened me more than the locked door. By the second day, my thoughts grew louder, not rebellious, circular. I replayed every conversation, every glance, every word that might have been misinterpreted. I told myself if I could just identify the precise moment I had failed, I could undo it. Correction had always worked before. But this time, there was nothing to fix. Only something to surrender. On the third day, I stopped waiting. That was when the room began to change. The silence thickened. The walls seemed closer, without mirrors. I lost track of my expressions. I couldn't see myself holding together. I realized then how much control had been external, without eyes on me. I didn't know who I was meant to be. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed and pressed my hands into the carpet, grounding myself in sensation. The fibers were rough, real. I focused on my breathing, in, out. I told myself this was strength, endurance. That word had been praised so often it felt virtuous. But endurance, I would later learn, can also be a form of erasure. By the fourth day, I stopped crying, not because I felt better, because there was nothing left to release. My body adjusted to containment quickly, faster than I expected, faster than I wanted. I slept when tired, woke when hungry, ate without appetite. I began to feel hollow, light, unanchored, as if the parts of me that wanted, questioned, resisted were being gently starved. No pain, just absence. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time lost shape. The days were measured only by the sound of footsteps outside my door, by the clink of a tray being set down, by the slow shift of light across the wall. I spoke aloud once, just to hear a voice, It sounded strange, smaller than I remembered. I didn't try again. When my mother finally came, she did not look angry. She looked satisfied. She stood just inside the doorway, not entering fully, as if the room itself had done her work. "You look calmer," she said. I nodded. Calm was expected. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" she asked. I nodded again. She waited. I understood then what she wanted. Not agreement, submission. "I was wrong," I said. The words tasted foreign, but they were familiar enough to be convincing. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good. That's all I needed to hear," she replied. She didn't ask what I had been wrong about. Details were unnecessary. When I returned to my room, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I was watched more closely. My movements were monitored. My correspondence disappeared. But the most significant change was internal. Something in me had folded inward, quietly, efficiently. I learned then how to survive by shrinking, how to place parts of myself somewhere unreachable, how to disappear without leaving. The person I was before that room still existed, but she no longer spoke. She observed, she waited, and she learned the most important lesson of all. Hope is a liability when your life belongs to someone else. People like to believe that marriages begin with promises. They imagine vows spoken softly, hands held tightly, a future unfolding like a gift. Mine began with numbers, not spoken aloud, not written where I could see them, but present in every look, every meeting, every silence that followed after the room. Nothing was discussed with me directly. That was the first sign. Decisions returned to the place they had always belonged, above my head. My schedule filled again, tighter than before. Dress fittings, dinners, introductions framed as coincidences. Men appeared whose names carried history longer than their interest in me. They were polite, measured, careful not to look too closely. Their eyes went first to my posture, then to my face, then, briefly, to my hands, as if confirming condition. My mother watched them all. She did not interfere. She evaluated. I remember the first time I understood the scale of what was happening. We were seated in a drawing room I had been raised to admire. Pale walls, heavy curtains, furniture chosen not for comfort, but for message. Tea was served. Conversation flowed easily, but not freely. They spoke of estates, of maintenance, of responsibility. Words that sound noble when detached from feeling. I sat quietly, answering when addressed. My voice calm, my smile practiced. I had learned how to exist without leaving fingerprints, at some point. One of the men, the one who would later become my husband, turned toward me and asked about my education. Not my interests, not my thoughts, my education. I answered politely. He nodded. Satisfied, it felt like passing an inspection. Afterward, my mother touched my arm lightly. Approval. That touch meant more than words ever had. That night, alone in my room, I tried to imagine what marriage would feel like. Not romance, reality. I tried to picture waking beside someone whose life was already complete, someone who did not need to know me deeply to claim me fully. The image felt distant, abstract, as if it belonged to someone else. The proposal was not dramatic. No declaration, no urgency, It arrived the way official things do, calmly, confidently, as if it had always been inevitable. My mother told me over breakfast. Her tone was conversational. "He is a good match," she said, as if discussing weather. "The arrangement is generous." I did not ask to whom. She didn't need to explain. I nodded. I had learned that nodding ended conversations more efficiently than resistance ever could. "You will be secure," she added. Security. That word was offered as consolation, as if safety and confinement were not often the same thing. I met him again after the engagement was decided. That order mattered. Not before, after. He treated me with courtesy, with distance, with a careful respect that never drifted into intimacy. We spoke about schedules, residences, expectations. He did not ask if I was happy. I did not offer the answer. Neither of us was under the illusion that happiness was relevant. We were not cruel to each other. That would have required investment. We were correct. The days leading to the wedding passed quickly, too quickly. I moved through them like a guest at my own life. People admired the dress, the venue, the scale. They said my name often, but never asked how I felt when I heard it spoken that way. Like a title being transferred. I slept poorly. Not from fear, from clarity. Once something is named, it loses the ability to surprise you. On the morning of the ceremony, I stood before the mirror and barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, because I looked finished, completed, as if there were no more revisions allowed. The woman staring back at me was elegant, composed, untouchable. She looked like someone who would never be questioned. She looked like someone who would endure. I realized then that endurance had become my defining trait. Not joy, not courage, endurance. The ceremony itself passed in fragments, music swelling and fading, faces blurring, words spoken automatically. I repeated the vows clearly. I had practiced clarity my entire life. My hand did not shake. That was noted. Later. People would comment on how calm I seemed. How brave. I wondered when calmness had become synonymous with surrender, that night, in the carriage that took us away. I sat beside a man who is now legally entitled to me. He did not touch me. He did not speak. We moved through the city while people cheered. I watched their faces pass by the window, bright with admiration, envy, celebration. None of them could see inside. They didn't know that something essential had already been exchanged. Not stolen, exchanged. Marriage did not feel like a beginning. It felt like arrival at a destination I had never chosen. The house we moved into was large, quiet, orderly, staffed, efficient. I was shown my rooms, shown my duties, shown where I fit. The routines settled quickly. Breakfast, visits, dinners. We spoke politely, lived separately, shared space without sharing selves. There was no violence, no cruelty, just distance, which, over time, became heavier than anger ever could. I learned how to be married the way I had learned everything else, by observation and correction. I learned when to speak, when to withdraw, when to appear content. The world approved. That was the cruelest part. Everyone told me I was fortunate, secure, envied. No one asked what it cost. At night, alone in a bed that felt unfamiliar despite its softness, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house breathe. The sounds were different now. New walls, new clocks, but the silence was the same. I understood then that marriage had not freed me from control. It had only transferred it. Ownership rarely changes form, only hands. I did not break immediately. That would have been too visible. I adapted. That was my skill. But something inside me marked the moment carefully. The moment I understood that my life had been priced, packaged, and delivered. And that realization, once settled, does not fade. It waits. Marriage, I learned, does not always arrive with conflict. Sometimes it arrives with order, schedules aligned, spaces divided, expectations clarified. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Just two lives placed side by side and instructed not to collide. That was how we began. We were not unkind to each other. We were careful not to intrude, careful not to demand, careful not to notice what was missing. Our conversations were functional, plans, logistics, appointments. He spoke to me as one might speak to a colleague, politely, efficiently, without curiosity. I responded in kind. I had been trained for this type of exchange long before marriage ever found me. At first, I told myself this was normal, that intimacy came later, that closeness was built, not assumed. I had lived my entire life believing effort would eventually be rewarded. The house settled into a rhythm quickly. It always does. Homes are very good at absorbing the habits of the people inside them. Morning routines formed without discussion. Breakfasts taken separately or together depending on schedules. Not desire. Evenings predictable. We slept in the same bed. That detail mattered to others more than it did to us. Physical proximity does not guarantee emotional contact. I learned that early. The bed was large, comfortable, neutral. We occupied it like tenants sharing a space neither had designed. There were nights when he fell asleep before me, his breathing steady, detached. I would lie awake beside him, listening, aware of the distance that existed even in inches. It was not loneliness that struck me then. It was invisibility. People assume absence of conflict means presence of peace. They are wrong. Peace implies rest. This was maintenance. We attended functions together. I learned how to stand slightly behind him, how to smile at the right moments, how to become an extension rather than an interruption. Guests complimented us. Such a well-matched couple. So composed. So fortunate. Fortunate. That word returned often. It followed me like a polite accusation. At home. Silence filled the spaces conversation might have occupied. Not awkward silence. Comfortable silence. That was the problem. Comfortable things rarely change. I learned how he liked his tea, how he arranged his papers, what topics bored him. He learned that I required very little. That lesson pleased him. It pleased everyone. There were moments, small ones, when I wondered if something could still grow between us. A shared glance across a room, a quiet comment made late at night, a rare laugh. I watched these moments carefully, like someone observing weather patterns. They never developed. They passed. We did not fight. We did not argue. We did not collide. And because of that, there was no rupture dramatic enough to justify leaving. That, I would later understand, was the trap. Time moved forward regardless. Days became months. Months folded into years. I became adept at occupying my role. I hosted dinners, remembered names, maintained appearances. I was praised for my adaptability. That word, too, carried weight. Adaptable women are valued. They bend quietly, at night. When the house was still and my husband worked late or slept early, I found myself wandering. Not physically, internally. I replayed conversations that had never happened, imagined versions of myself that spoke without calculation. These thoughts felt indulgent, dangerous. I learned to keep them contained. sometimes. I wondered if he noticed. Not my dissatisfaction, my absence. But absence is easy to miss when it arrives politely. The first time I realized how deeply separate our lives were came unexpectedly. I fell ill. Nothing dramatic. A fever, weakness, a few days confined to bed. He was attentive in the way one is attentive to responsibility. He arranged for care, ensured schedules adjusted. He asked if I needed anything. I said no. The lie came easily. At one point, he sat beside the bed and read quietly. Not to me, near me. I listened to his voice without absorbing the words. For a moment, just one, I wondered if this was what companionship felt like. Then he stood, wished me rest, and left. The door closed softly behind him. The sound stayed. Recovery returned me to routine quickly. No space for reflection. Life prefers continuity. I resumed my duties. So did he. The illness passed. The separation remained. I began to understand something unsettling. I was not unhappy in a way that demanded action. I was not miserable enough to justify disruption. That made my condition invisible. Invisible problems are the hardest to escape. Occasionally. I received letters from my mother. They were efficient, proud. She spoke of success, of admiration, of outcomes. You have done well, she wrote. That sentence landed heavier than any criticism ever had, because she was right. By every standard that mattered to her, and to the world that shaped us, I had succeeded. And yet, something inside me remained untouched, unacknowledged, unlived. One evening, after a particularly polished dinner, I stood alone by a window. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Movement, noise, life, all contained at a safe distance. I realized then that my marriage had not failed. It had functioned exactly as intended. That realization brought no comfort, only clarity. I did not yet know how or when change would come. I only knew that this quiet, orderly life, this careful sharing of space without connection, was unsustainable. Not because it was painful, because it was numbing, and numbness, sustained long enough, becomes its own kind of damage. Motherhood did not arrive with joy. Not at first. It arrived with exhaustion, with confusion, with a strange, unfamiliar fear that had nothing to do with myself. I remember the moment I realized I was pregnant. There was no celebration, no announcement, just a quiet awareness settling into my body, heavier than any expectation I had carried before. For years, my life had been defined by roles chosen for me: daughter, wife, figure. Motherhood was the first role that frightened me, not because it confined me, but because it expanded me. The pregnancy unfolded politely. No complications, no drama. Doctors spoke in calm, confident tones. Schedules were made, preparations arranged. Everything progressed as expected. That phrase followed me again, as expected. My husband received the news with composure. Approval, relief, an heir had been secured. I watched his face carefully, searching for something else. Wonder, perhaps, fear, tenderness. I found responsibility. That was enough for him, for the world. My body changed quietly, gradually. I felt it before anyone noticed. A shift in balance, a new awareness of space. For the first time, my body was not something to be presented. It was something occupied. That realization unsettled me and comforted me. I walked more slowly, not from weakness, from instinct. There was something within me that required protection, something that did not belong to contracts or expectations or negotiations, something that responded only to me. People treated me differently then, more gently, more cautiously. They spoke to me as if I had become fragile. I was not fragile. I was alert. Every sound felt sharper. Every movement mattered. I slept poorly, not from discomfort, but from vigilance. I listened to my own body in ways I never had before. For the first time, it spoke back. I remember the first time I felt the child move. It startled me, a brief pressure, a flutter. Not painful, not dramatic, just unmistakably alive. I sat very still. One hand pressed to my stomach, breath held. That small movement did something profound. It interrupted my detachment. For years, I had lived slightly removed from myself, observing, managing, enduring. Now there was no distance. Something depended on me in a way that could not be delegated. I cried then, quietly, not from sadness, from recognition. Motherhood rearranged my priorities without asking permission. I began to imagine the future differently, not in terms of appearances or outcomes, but in terms of safety, warmth, presence. I wondered what kind of world I had agreed to bring a child into, and what kind of woman I would need to become to make it survivable. The birth itself was unremarkable by public standards, private, controlled, painful in the way all births are. But pain I could name, pain with purpose. When they placed the child in my arms, I expected something overwhelming. Love, perhaps joy. What I felt was quieter, heaviness, responsibility, a deep, anchoring awareness that this small body trusted me completely. That trust terrified me and grounded me. I studied his face as if committing it to memory. The softness, the vulnerability. He was utterly defenseless and utterly real. No one could mistake him for an asset. He cried without shame, needed without apology, for the first time. I was allowed, required, to respond instinctively, not correctly, not gracefully, but honestly. The days that followed blurred together, nights fractured by wakefulness, my body sore, altered, unfamiliar. Yet I felt more present than I ever had. Exhaustion stripped away pretense. There was no energy left for performance, only care. My husband observed this transformation politely. He remained respectful, distant. He fulfilled his role, provided, arranged. He held the child awkwardly, uncertain. I did not resent him for that. We had both been shaped by systems that did not reward tenderness. I learned the rhythms of motherhood slowly, feeding, soothing, listening. I learned to interpret cries, hunger, discomfort, fear. Each response felt immediate, necessary. No rehearsal, no approval. The world narrowed, and in narrowing, it became clearer for the first time. I experienced attachment without transaction. This child did not admire me, did not evaluate me. He needed me. That need was uncomplicated, and in that simplicity, I found something radical, purpose. There were moments, fleeting but sharp, when fear returned. What if I failed him? What if I repeated what had been done to me? The thought sat heavily. I watched myself closely, not with judgment, with caution. I promised myself, silently, fiercely, that I would not mistake control for care, that I would not confuse silence with strength. Motherhood did not free me, not immediately, but it awakened something that had been dormant, a willingness to protect, not reputation, not structure, but life. That instinct, once activated, does not easily retreat. As my child grew, so did my awareness of the house, of the marriage, of the quiet distances I had accepted. What had once felt tolerable now felt dangerous. Not to me, to him. I began to see my life through a new lens, not as a series of obligations, but as an environment. And environments shape outcomes. Late at night, when the house was still and the child slept against my chest, I allowed myself thoughts I had forbidden for years. What if this life was not enough? What if endurance was not the lesson I wanted to pass on? What if survival could look like something else? These questions did not demand answers. They simply existed. That was new. I did not yet know how change would come. I only knew that motherhood had shifted the axis of my world, and once shifted, it could not be restored to its original position. Awakening does not arrive like liberation. It does not burst through walls or announce itself with clarity. Most of the time, it comes quietly, after damage has already been done, when the cost of not seeing has grown heavier than the fear of looking. I did not wake up suddenly. I woke up slowly, in pieces, over months that felt deceptively calm. Motherhood had narrowed my world, and in doing so, sharpened it. What once felt tolerable now felt dangerous. What once felt distant now felt immediate. I began to see my life not as mine alone, but as something my child was absorbing without choice. That realization changed everything. There is a particular kind of fear that comes with understanding you have stayed too long. Not too long in years, too long in permission. I watched the house differently then. The quiet hallways no longer felt orderly. They felt hollow. The routines that had once provided structure now revealed their rigidity. Breakfast at the same hour. Voices kept low. Emotions managed. I imagined my child learning these rhythms. Learning when not to speak, when to shrink, when to observe instead of participate. The thought tightened something in my chest. My husband did not change. That was the point. He continued as he always had. Efficient, distant, correct. He loved our child in the way he understood love. Provision, planning, protection through structure. I did not fault him for this. We had both been raised in systems that rewarded restraint and punished excess. But I began to understand that his version of safety would one day feel like confinement to our child. And that knowledge was unbearable. I noticed myself becoming restless, not outwardly, internally, a tension that did not release. I found myself standing in rooms without remembering why I had entered them, holding conversations while my thoughts moved elsewhere. I began to feel like a guest again, not in my marriage, in my life. There were moments when guilt followed close behind these realizations. Hadn't I chosen this? Hadn't I agreed? The answer, I knew, was complicated, Choice requires access to alternatives. I had been given outcomes, not options. Understanding that distinction did not absolve me, but it clarified me. I started leaving the house more often. Small errands, walks, nothing dramatic. I needed space where no one expected anything of me, where I could exist without performing. The world outside felt louder than I remembered, messier, alive. I watched other mothers with their children, imperfect, impatient, laughing openly. They looked tired. They looked real. I envied them in a way that surprised me. At home, I grew quieter, not submissive, observant. I measured the distance between what was said and what was meant, between presence and connection. I began to understand that silence can be consensual until it becomes compulsory. That was the shift. There were nights when I lay awake, listening to my child breathe, and felt a grief I could not name. Not for what I had lost, for what I had never been allowed to become. I wondered who I might have been if my life had not been decided before I understood desire. The question no longer felt indulgent, it felt necessary. I thought of my mother often during that time, not with anger, with a strange, measured clarity. She had believed she was protecting me, preparing me. She had equated control with care, discipline with love, in many ways. She had succeeded. I was safe, respected, admired. But safety without agency is not safety. It is preservation, and preservation, taken too far, suffocates. I did not confront her, not then. I was still learning how to hold my own thoughts without apology. Instead, I watched myself. I noticed how often I hesitated before speaking, how quickly I dismissed my own instincts. Motherhood had awakened something powerful, but it had also revealed how much of myself I had trained not to trust. The awakening was not dramatic. It did not produce immediate action. That is why it was dangerous. I could have returned to routine. I could have adjusted again. Adaptation was my greatest strength and my greatest liability. One afternoon, I watched my child play on the floor. He was focused, absorbed, unself-conscious. He looked up at me and smiled, wide, unguarded, no performance, no calculation. In that moment, something settled with undeniable certainty. I would not teach him how to disappear. Not quietly, not politely, not at all. That decision frightened me more than marriage ever had, because it implied consequence, change, disruption. The systems I had survived would resist. They always do. I began to prepare, not outwardly, but internally. I practiced telling the truth in small ways, admitting uncertainty, naming discomfort. I let conversations feel awkward. That alone felt revolutionary. My husband noticed. Eventually, not because I announced anything, because equilibrium had shifted. He asked if something was wrong. I considered the question carefully. No, I said finally. Something is becoming clear. He did not ask for elaboration. That was his nature. Clarity unsettles those invested in stability. I did not yet know what the outcome would be, only that return was no longer possible. Once you see the architecture of your life clearly, you cannot pretend it is coincidence. And once you understand that endurance has been mistaken for virtue, you cannot unknow it. Awakening does not make you brave. It makes you honest. And honesty, when delayed, arrives heavy, with consequences, with grief, with resolve. Leaving is rarely dramatic. That is the lie we are taught, that departure arrives with shouting. with doors slamming, with irreversible declarations spoken aloud. Most of the time, leaving begins quietly, long before anyone else notices. It begins the moment staying requires you to disappear. I did not decide to leave my marriage in a single moment. I arrived at the decision the way one arrives at the end of a long corridor, step by step, noticing only afterward how far one has already walked. Once the awakening took hold, I began to see my life with an accuracy that was both clarifying and cruel. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The house still functioned. The routines still held. My husband still fulfilled his role. I fulfilled mine. That was the problem. We were performing continuity while something essential had already ended. I began to imagine separation not as escape, but as necessity. That distinction mattered. Escape implies panic. Necessity implies responsibility. I was no longer acting solely for myself. That changed the moral weight of every thought. There were practical questions. Where would I live? How would the child be affected? What would the world say? I approached these questions the way I had approached everything else in my life. Carefully, methodically, without visible emotion. Emotion had always complicated matters. Clarity did not. My husband sensed the distance before I spoke of it. Distance has a presence. It alters posture, timing, tone. He asked, one evening, without accusation, whether I was content. The word lingered between us. Contentment had been the unspoken goal of our marriage. Not happiness, not connection, contentment. I considered answering honestly. Then I realized honesty would require more than a word. No, I said. It was the first time I had used that word without softening it. He absorbed it quietly. Asked nothing further. That silence told me everything. The conversation that followed weeks later was inevitable, not explosive, measured. We sat across from each other, hands resting on the table, as if discussing an arrangement that had simply reached its conclusion. I spoke carefully, not because I feared him, because I respected the truth. I can no longer live this way, I said. He listened. He always did. What way? He asked. That question revealed the distance more clearly than anger ever could. This life, the quiet, correct, orderly one, had never felt like a compromise to him. It had felt like success. I explained what I could, that I felt absent from myself, that the marriage functioned without connection, that I feared teaching our child endurance instead of agency. He did not argue. He did not plead. He responded as a man trained to manage outcomes. We discussed logistics, schedules, arrangements, appearances. Emotion entered the room only briefly, like a draft through an open door. Then it passed. I did not expect relief, and yet, once the decision was spoken aloud, my body responded immediately. I slept better, not longer, deeper, as if some internal vigilance had finally been released. The world reacted predictably. Confusion, concern, speculation. People wanted reasons, clear ones. They are uncomfortable with quiet endings. I did not provide what they sought, not out of secrecy, out of precision. Not every truth requires a witness. My mother's response arrived in a letter, carefully written, measured, disappointed. She spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of reputation. She reminded me of everything that had been done for me. I read it once, then again, then set it aside for the first time. I did not feel compelled to respond immediately. That delay was itself an answer. Separation rearranged my life in unexpected ways, not by removing structure, but by revealing how much of it had been external, without constant performance. I felt unmoored, and then, slowly, oriented. I learned the texture of my own days, the sound of my own thoughts without interruption. The child adjusted more easily than I had feared. Children adapt when honesty replaces tension. He did not understand the mechanics of separation, but he understood presence, and presence had increased. That mattered. I moved into a smaller space, simpler, less impressive. I noticed how differently my body responded there. I moved more freely, sat where I pleased, left objects where I used them. Small freedoms, but cumulative. There were nights when doubt returned, when memory pressed close, when the old training whispered caution. You are being ungrateful. You are disrupting stability. You are risking too much. I listened, and then I chose not to obey. Cutting away is not an act of violence. It is an act of precision. It requires understanding where you end and something else begins. I had never been taught that distinction. I was learning it late, painfully, deliberately. The marriage ended quietly, legally, publicly, without spectacle. I did not feel triumphant. I felt aligned. For the first time, my outer life resembled my inner one. That alignment was unfamiliar and fragile. I did not yet know what would come next. Freedom does not arrive fully formed. It begins as space, unfilled, uncertain, but breathable. When people speak of freedom, they often imagine motion, leaving, escaping, crossing some visible line between what was and what could be. They rarely speak about what comes after, the stillness, the quiet that follows once there is no longer anything pressing against you. Freedom, I learned, does not rush in to fill the space you clear. It waits, after the separation. My life did not transform overnight. There were no revelations waiting just beyond the door, no sudden happiness. What remained was space, unfurnished, unscripted, unforgiving in its honesty. I woke each morning without immediate obligation, no role to perform, no expectation to fulfill. That absence unsettled me. For years, my identity had been shaped by reaction, responding to demands, adjusting to structures, aligning with outcomes set by others. Now there was nothing to push against, and without resistance. I felt strangely undefined. I learned quickly that freedom requires skills I had never been taught. Decision-making without approval. Rest without guilt. Desire without justification. These were not instincts for me. They were disciplines. I made small choices at first. What to eat, when to walk, where to sit. I noticed how often I paused before acting, waiting for permission that never arrived. Old habits do not dissolve quietly. They linger. There were days when loneliness arrived unexpectedly, not the loneliness of confinement, but the loneliness of responsibility. Every choice now belonged to me. There was no one else to blame. That clarity was both empowering and frightening. I spent long hours simply observing the city, the rhythms of ordinary lives. I watched people move without ceremony, arguing openly, laughing without restraint, making mistakes in public. Their lives were imperfect and unhidden. I began to understand that what I had once mistaken for chaos was simply authenticity uncontained. My child adjusted more easily than I had dared to hope. Children sense honesty. They relax in it, The tension he had absorbed without language began to loosen. He asked fewer questions, laughed more freely. I watched him closely, alert to signs of damage. What I found instead was resilience and relief. Motherhood, in this new context, felt different, less performative, more present. I no longer worried about appearing correct. I worried about being there, listening, responding, not shaping, just accompanying. I learned to apologize to my child. That act alone felt revolutionary. I thought often of my mother during this time, not with resentment, with a careful, almost anthropological curiosity. She had lived her life inside rigid structures that rewarded control and punished deviation. She had mistaken survival for success, and she had passed that understanding on to me. I did not excuse the damage, but I no longer needed to carry it forward. Understanding does not require inheritance. There were moments when the past resurfaced sharply, a phrase spoken a certain way, a familiar tone, a room that felt too ordered. I felt my body respond before my mind caught up. Tightening, retreating, preparing. I learned to pause, to breathe, to remind myself where I was, who I was. Trauma, I discovered, is not memory. It is reflex, and reflex can be retrained. I began to write. Not to publish, not to explain, simply to record. Words came slowly at first, then more freely. I did not aim for beauty, only accuracy. I wanted to understand my own story without ornament, without justification, without apology. There were people who entered my life later, not as saviors, not as solutions, just as witnesses. I did not rush intimacy. I did not confuse attention with connection. That lesson had been costly. I learned to let relationships form without urgency, to allow them to remain undefined until they earned definition. One evening, years after the separation, I stood alone at a window much like the one I had once stood beside as a girl. The city beyond it was different now. So was I. I did not feel trapped. I did not feel triumphant. I felt present. That felt like enough. There are still moments when grief arrives. For the years shaped without consent. For the woman I might have been had choice arrived sooner. I let that grief exist. Grief does not require correction. It requires acknowledgement. People sometimes ask if I regret leaving. The question assumes regret is the opposite of endurance. It is not. Regret is the refusal to see clearly. I see very clearly. What remained of my life after everything was stripped away was not freedom as it is often imagined. It was responsibility, ownership, the quiet work of living without disguises. I am not extraordinary. I did not escape dramatically. I did not conquer anything. I simply stopped disappearing. And that, it turns out, was the most radical act